Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first Bounty episode of the new year. I'm Spectre. With me is Z. Hope everyone had a great holidays and New Year's and whatnot. And yeah, it was a cool 3 weeks to be off, but it's good to be back as well. And we got some cool topics. Yeah, we're only a few days into the new year, and at this point, there's already been a few interesting topics put out. So I guess we'll just jump right into them here. So up first, we have a post on REDOS vulnerabilities. Z wanted to bring this one up because it raises a little bit of an interesting discussion. It's more of like an opinion piece sort of thing, not really, like a vulnerability read up or whatever. We have covered a few of these REDOS type vulnerabilities before, short for, regular expression based DOS. So yeah, I'll let Z take this one because he found this one interesting. But yeah, like I said, it's mostly like an opinion piece, and I think we will probably share opinions with the author on this one. We'll probably pretty
Well,
follow a pretty straight path on that.
I actually kind of disagree with the author here to an extent. Like we agree on the details, but then not the extent. Uh, so kind of taking what the post is about, RA-DOS vulnerabilities. Uh, Basic idea, or the too long didn't read here at the top. RA-DOS vulnerabilities are overwhelmingly indistinguishable from malicious noise. Uh, really taking the position that effectively RA-DOS vulnerabilities don't matter. They produce security fatigue. They're noise. Developers who get the reports are going to look them and see that as just more, busy work to get done rather than an actual vulnerability. Um, their risk is usually fairly context specific, and they tend to get fairly high CVSS scores. Um, Given something like a I guess I could pull up the CVSS calculator exactly, but I believe if you gave this with like a no authorization required and assuming like the worst case scenario, you basically have a 7.5 CVSS score, which is fairly high for what it is. And then they also call out just misaligned incentives in terms of CVEs, numbers, just people kind of putting these out there because they're really easy CVE to detect. Um, uh, a proper grep can find you these vulnerabilities oftentimes fairly easily. And I agree with them on several of the points. CVE numbers. So I agree with them on the fact like CVE numbers should not be a result in and of itself. Like people shouldn't be pushing just for a CVE number. And I think that just comes from people mistreating the value or missing the value of what a CVE is worth. Thing as I have the CVE number, therefore goes on the resume or whatever, resume padding, and nobody looks at what the vulnerability actually is. It just is got a CV, that is good. Not really digging anymore. When I tend to see CVs on like a resume, I will glance, at least spot check some of them to see what they are and make some determination there because yeah, like not every CVE is the same. Uh that said, that is one of the issues that he calls out here. I agree with him there. I agree on the risk aspect. Just in the sense that very often CVSS just isn't a good capture of severity when it comes to application security. It's designed around network security and keeping it kind of in that context, and so you end up being left with a CVSS score that can be rather high when it shouldn't be. And you also have the opposite problem: low severity vulnerabilities, according to CVSS, that should be rated quite a bit higher. We talked about that before with one of the GitLab things where they were allowing information disclosure issues to kind of get a higher bounty because their rating wouldn't get that. But if you could expose certain piece of information, like in their context, it kind of mattered a lot more. CVSS just doesn't capture that, so I agree with them there, and I agree it can kind of do the fatigue aspect. So I agree on all these points. I feel like their entire argument here really comes down to, well, part of their argument. I guess not the entire argument, but part of it just comes down to, with these RE-DOS attacks, no attacker bothers to actually do these. You don't hear about RE-DOS actually being weaponized in the wild. I can't think of any cases. I'm sure it's happened. I can't actually think of many cases where it's happened though. Um it's a fair point to say, like, it's more effective, or at least just as effective to do a normal DDoS or denial of service. Um, but I feel like their entire argument really comes down to the scoring of availability attacks. So CVSS weighs the confidentiality, integrity, and availability all is equal. So you get that if you just have a high of availability and none for the other two, um, that's 7.5. If you have high on confidentiality and none for the other two, that's still 7.5. Like they're all equal and doesn't really account, I think, for modern systems where the availability of the application is maybe mitigated at other layers. Just in terms of how things get deployed, just other layers kind of taking care of some of these issues. Um, they also call that out, like it's an issue that's really focused on that application has it, but everything else might mitigate the actual issue from it. I don't know. I mean, I want to bring this up and kind of talk through it a little bit just to hear back some other opinions. Like, do you think RE should matter? Um, I feel like if we're going to say no to RE we're kind of just saying like none of the availability attacks matter because you also don't hear about like binary exploitation that are just denial of service attacks getting exploited, but do they matter? Maybe. Um,
Well, to be fair, I think there's different types of like denial of service attacks and different severities, right? So one thing he points out in this post, in like the cheap shots section that I thought I would highlight here, is he says that uh, the bug class is based on unreliable premises that there's no timeouts or resource limits anywhere in the system, which might have been true, once upon a time, a long time ago, but that isn't really true anymore. So it like RE even calling it a DOS in some cases might be a stretch, either because of resource limits or timeouts, or because a lot of them are reached in these really weird and obscure ways that aren't like they're going to be locked behind some kind of functionality. Um, Obviously, that's not going to be true in every case, but it does seem like a good number of these RE-DOS vulnerabilities are like harder to reach and harder to actually do anything useful with.
it varies a lot in terms of reachability. There are some
For
that are
sure.
really easy. There are some that are difficult. I mean, it's anywhere regex is used, it could potentially see this. Some languages don't really support the backtracking that makes this applicable, but beyond that, like there's a lot of places it could be. The
Yeah.
problem though, in terms of the unreliable premise, just there being no timeouts or resource limits elsewhere, is while that's true, you generally applications nowadays are being deployed with a lot of limits in place and things in place that will scale up if necessary and all of that. At the same time, like some of these vulnerabilities, the ones that he calls out at the top as being mostly useless, are in libraries. You don't know where that library is going to be used. You can't make the claim that this library is only going to be used in like this place and deployed in this way. You kind of just have to assume a bit of a standalone, and that's where CVSS doesn't really capture any of that context about how it's being used or how it might be used. And I mean, I don't know how you would do this either. I haven't seen a good scoring system that captures a lot of this nuance without also just being complete pain to use in the first place. Uh, but when it's in a library, you can't say that every user of the library is going to want to even expose it in a vulnerable way. That's a fair thing to at least comment on. But also that they're going to deploy it in such a way that there are the redundancies, there are the mitigating place.
Yeah. My main point there was just that, like, I don't think it's fair to compare like an RE-DOS to, let's say, like taking down a binary service by crashing it or something. I think it is a little bit different, um, because of like the mitigating factors when it comes to something like RE-DOS.
But
The
with
other,
the binary services, oftentimes you have those, so they're going to automatically come back up if you take them down. It's not just going to be a perma crash. So I think there is some similarity. There is a difference in crashing the entire process versus holding up the CPU, whereas holding up the CPU very well might be less noticed, less likely to have something else spin up and like cover the fact that requests are failing. Um, But at the same time, like, I think it's at least fair because their argument comes down or part of their argument, sorry, comes down to just the, scoring of them and any sort of availability issue. Now, another issue is just CVSS only gives you a none, low, or high. There's no medium, there's no room for much discretion. Either it takes something down or it doesn't, or just delays it is basically the distinguishing factor that like I feel like part of the issues with CVSS and with people just mistreating CVs or thinking CVs are more valuable than they are.
Well, for sure. We kind of talked about this before, but I don't really like CVSS in general. I do like notice it and take note of it, but in a lot of cases, I think it falls short. But the other important point that's brought up here is the security fatigue aspect of it. And one of the central points of the post is the signal to noise ratio on RE-DOS reports is unacceptable and a security risk in itself. Um, and that's something we've kind of talked a bit about before too, is that idea of like these really easy um basically you could find these kinds of bugs automatically and then just feed them into bug bounties and bombard triagers with them. And I think that is a fair point as well. Even if the impact is like, even if he was wrong or whatever uh on the sorry, I'm trying to think back. Uh yeah, with the impact basically. I think it's still fair to point out that like because these bugs are so easy to find and also easy to misunderstand on the point of whoever's reporting them, um that is like a fair point to keep in mind, I think. And I can kind of understand why somebody would be angry, I guess, if they had to deal with that a lot. Um
I
but
can
yeah.
understand it, but at the same time, there is a proper signal there too. Like there is an issue that I think should be considered in that it can impact availability. I'd agree with like, Big Bounty. People are just reporting there's an RE DOS in this library, no concern about how it's hittable or whatever. No look at can you actually, something with it versus just it's present. As you were mentioning, just the mitigating factors on actually accessing it. If there are other factors in there, like I would say when it comes to bug bounty, you need to validate your reports. Um, can't just report because it looks like it could maybe be a little bit vulnerable. But that's an issue with bug bounties and those doing that in general, not just with RE DOS.
That's true. It might be taking it out on like the wrong party in a sense. Maybe it's not like the RE DOS as a bug class's fault. It's more just people that make those kinds of reports will probably make them regardless of whether or not RE DOS vulnerabilities can be submitted or not. So yeah, it's a
Yeah.
fair point.
On the fatigue though, like it is a fair point. Another thing that causes fatigue is just all the version bumps. You have like the GitHub bot, I forget what it's called right now, that basically just checks the version of all your dependencies and will auto submit a PR for like bumping them. Like that creates a bit of fatigue too when you just see that over and over and over again. So like I agree with the core problem that there is an issue with fatigue. It's just getting rid of REDOS, I don't think does much about it.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Um,
I also want to call out really quickly the little meme they've got here that is, in my opinion, quite accurate. The developer tooling versus security tooling, which they call out as part of the fatigue also, but just developer tooling, I can take any input you can think of, have tab completion support or all these different shells and copy onto any machine without problem. Security tooling, need to use Ubuntu 16.04, disable the firewall. Just like I feel that so much with so many security tools where you try and run them and you need to get just the right environment and figure out all these little random issues that they've got with getting it spun up. Um, good meme. Uh,
it's
it's just a
super
general problem.
unfortunate how bad security tooling is, and in some cases the pricing is just absolutely insane too, even if it's still bad. So yeah, security tooling is like, if we had better security tooling, things like this probably would be a lot less annoying. But as it stands, security tooling kind of sucks, and it's just an unfortunate reality
Yeah, I
in
mean,
general.
security people don't make the best developers.
And it's just like it's a kind of a niche market, right? It makes sense to like not put a ton of resources into it, because your developer market is going to be like hundreds of times larger than your security researcher market. So yeah, it's unfortunate, but it is the way it is.
But even the
Um,
security tools to be used by a developer, has I mean, yeah, security still is the more niche market than just all developers, but still a pretty big market. But it's just a lot of security tools tend to be written as really quick hacks. And then they just kind of keep growing on that spaghetti code or whatever, rather than actually being engineered up as like something to be handling a lot of the issues. It's I guess another part of it is like you can trust a developer to be able to figure out certain types of issues, like needing a particular version of whatever. It's a really annoying ask, but I know a developer could solve that problem. Whereas the developer tooling, kind of going a little bit more towards the beginner, maybe somebody who's just learning to develop or whatever, being a bit more friendly in general. I don't know. I mean, we're kind of going a bit off the main topic here, but I did at
but
least want
I
to
think
shout
it
out the
does
meme.
feed into it. Like it is like part of why that fatigue exists. So I think it's fair to go into it a little bit.
Makes it a lot more tedious to do any of the work. Like as a developer, just trying to fix some of the issues can become a lot more tedious when the tooling is tedious to use.
Definitely. All right, so with that out of the way, we'll get into some of our vulnerabilities of the episode. Up first, our vulnerabilities, we have a post by Sam Curry titled Web Hackers versus the Auto Industry. And as you can expect, it's about multiple vulnerabilities that were found in multiple car brands. That includes Kia, Honda, Nissan, Mercedes, Hyundai, Ferrari, and more. Um, there's 8 or so vulnerabilities that are talked about a little bit here, although only 5 are covered in detail in the post. The other 2 or 3 are covered in like Twitter threads, one of which I think we covered before we went for our break, actually. Um, so, yeah, as always, the link will be in our show notes page and in the description and in chat for those with us live who want to check out some of those ones and follow the Twitter threads. But yeah, the bugs range from full account takeovers to RCE. And I figured I'll cover some of the vulnerabilities that I found interesting, and then Z can go into the ones that he found interesting. Um, so the second bug, which I'll scroll to here really quickly. The second bug I thought had some cool aspects to it. Sorry, the post is really long. It's taking me a bit to scroll. So yeah, the second bug I thought was pretty interesting, partially due to the RCE aspect, and also because they were able to gain access to hundreds of internal tools on Mercedes-Benz and Rolls-Royce. So the root cause of the bug was a misconfigured SSO. So they started looking for some domains, just enumerating, and found this umass.mercedes-benz.com domain, which was for repair shops to request tool access if they needed them. Interestingly, public registration was enabled there, and the database for those accounts was the same database that was used for core employees. From there, it was a matter of finding some tooling that would redirect to the single sign-on. Again, they just kind of guessed at some domains, and they found get.mercedes-benz.com, and that ended up working. So when you go to that domain, you get redirected to single sign-on. But because they were able to register an account on that repair shop domain, they could log in using that. And then after setting up 2FA, they were able to log into the GitHub instance, which had a bunch of internal docs and source code for their projects. They were also able to get code execution by getting access to tooling with things like Spring Boot consoles and such. They don't really, elaborate on that too much. But
It's all the DevOps infrastructure. Like you can get code
it totally makes
execution. It's
sense.
Jenkins. They had AWS and like cloud compute control panels in there. They could access whatever. One
It's
thing is
definitely
like
not hard to imagine. Yeah.
This is one of those issues that comes from they set up SSO, so they hit like that minimum bar of setting up that auth system, and then they don't go beyond that. They don't go and actually validate the intents or validate the
Yeah.
privileges of any user in it. They just look up does user exist, and basically if you do, you're authorized to access absolutely everything behind their SSO. And that's why finding this UMass page basically gave them access on everything. It's fun to see it done like this because I have seen this in a number of organizations where it's a very flat authentication scheme. They'll have this nice login system, they just won't actually check any of the privileges beyond that. It's just assumed if you have an account, you're good to go. And it just creates this very fragile barrier where as soon as you can get through, which isn't in many cases, many organizations, they don't have this sort of public facing thing. Like this just isn't really an option. But as soon as somebody does get through, they get everything, keys to the kingdom, basically. So it's interesting to see them, this is a case where it's gone bad for them. I have seen this with a number of organizations. Of course, a lot of my assessments have been more focused on specific applications, so I didn't get to look for alternative ways to just create an account or what. Oh well, they're checking auth, and I can maybe call out not doing more checks, but that's about all I could do in my cases. But it is the sort of thing that um it's nice. It's kind of nice to see some that I've warned about people doing actually getting called out or actually being seen in the wild, I guess is the way I'd put it, because it is an issue I've warned about before and just kind of get ignored at times. Consultant, sometimes you've just gotta make the statement and move on. But yeah, I fun bug nonetheless. I really like number two here.
Yeah. I find it interesting that that endpoint um was even like had the open registration. Like basically all they had for protecting it was like a hidden domain kind of thing. Like
Well,
there
the
really
use
wasn't a lot of gatekeeping on that.
the use for that though is for public, like I believe that's the repair shops be able to register on there to be able to go and like, hey, we want to register and request access to something. So like getting on that
It
tool kind
is.
of makes sense that they would allow anybody to go ahead and register there because they don't know everybody who's going to need to do that in advance. They don't want to create like some longer flow for it. It's just in
Well, it's just
combination with the SSO, it kind of breaks down because suddenly a lot of the SSO is being used for internal tooling, whereas this is external public. Um,
yeah.
and go ahead.
It's just that typically those kinds of systems where, it's requesting access to tooling and stuff, the registration is also gate kept a little bit. Like it's a private, somewhat private program.
Well, like I don't
Um,
think the tooling that they're requesting here is like literally access to the internal tooling. I believe this is access for like tooling for the repair shops fixing Mercedes vehicles, like to be able to access like specialized tools that they need to do whatever. I don't know much on the automotive side, so I can't really go into that, but I could imagine the case where it's like perhaps a security screwdriver sort of thing. Um, that sort of
yeah.
tooling, not access to all the internal tooling, which is just kind of an incidental benefit of doing that.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking of tooling as well in terms of like software for interfacing with the car if you needed to do that. That said, I didn't like look too much into it or go to the site or anything, so that was kind of just my assumption
I'm
based on reading it.
I'm not
But
sure about that because they call out the fact that they got that information out of the Git rather than out of UMOS. That they were able to
yeah,
get
that's fair.
information about communicating with vehicles through Git.
Yeah, that's fair to point out. Um, yeah, there is also another like kind of fun way they exploited this attack that I thought I'd call out. One of the apps that they were able to get access to was the Mattermost, which is like Slack. So they were able to join like any channel in their internal Slack, including security channels. So they kind of you know went on this potentially attack scenario where someone could impersonate a security person and use that to move unilaterally throughout the network. I thought that was kind of a cool part of it. This was just one of the many tools you could access, but yeah, it was they show a screenshot there of how you could potentially, abuse that or whatever. Um, the other bug that I thought was interesting was the fifth bug, and it was in digital license plates. And this was interesting because I didn't even know these were a thing really. But apparently, a few months ago in California, digital license plates were legalized. So just bring it up here for those who are watching. Um, and yeah, so these plates not only included a SIM card for tracking, but also allowed remote updating of the plate slogan and background. And it had a feature where it could set the plate to stolen in the event of the vehicle being stolen, which I thought was kind of a neat feature. But of course, it's digital, and typically stuff like this isn't implemented very well. So that's why we're talking about it in the context here. Um, yeah, so they started looking at their mobile app and HTTP requests, and discovered that there was also an enterprise functionality where you could manage like a fleet of vehicles if you were a corporate account. So essentially, you could have like a master account and then sub accounts underneath it for vehicles which you would invite in. Um, so that kind of pointed to the fact that there was a role system going on here. Um, and yeah, as it turned out, the role of your account is directly tied into the JavaScript of the app. So you could basically just switch your account into like a corporate role or some other role. Now, this didn't seem to yield anything right away. They updated their account to the corporate role, but they couldn't seem to authenticate. I assume they say they ran into authorization vulnerabilities, but I think that was a typo because they later say authorization errors. But anyway, they were able to bypass that by just figuring out they could still invite users to the modified account. So they could invite another malicious account, which would get assigned the necessary permissions in the proper fashion, and that got around those issues. After enumerating some of the role types, they eventually found this reviver role, which seemed to be like an admin type role. And when they did that, they noticed the front end broke. The UI was completely messed up, buttons couldn't get clicked. And they assumed that's because, that account's meant to be used in an admin panel UI. The regular customer facing portal just couldn't really handle that, but they were still able to hit the admin API and utilize the admin endpoints. So that included being able to being able to view vehicle locations, update plates, add new users to accounts, and other stuff. And not only could they attack individual users, but they could also attack dealer plates as well. And I believe some of those like corporate accounts with the fleets and stuff. So quite a big impact. And a stupid bug, like just being able to edit the role in the JavaScript like that.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, so
but like I said, with this kind of product, it doesn't surprise me a ton.
yeah, I mean, it is a like a JSON blob that they were able to update, not so much as editing the JavaScript itself, but editing a JSON blob.
Yeah,
They had the blob that has the type value in it, and then through a sort of mass assignment style issue. They don't detail the specifics of it. They just say it's kind of a mass assignment style issue. They were able to update any of the field inside that blob, including the type. So that's where they end up trying corporate and later found the reviver and uh there's another reviver and reviver rule, kind of two different ones there. End up finding actually they could use numbers and basically just figure out what each number was indexed to. The reviver being 0, the reviver rule 4, but effectively privilege escalation there through like the mass assignment. Mass assignment bugs are pretty fun to see. Uh, because there's a sort of issue that usually like there's some way to exploit them, but you have to do a little bit of work on them. So yeah, definitely fun to kind of see here. That was one of the more entertaining bugs in this list. That said, the one that kind of made me laugh was, I believe, the fourth one in this list. And that was just a SQL injection and regex authorization bypass. Regex authorization. You already know it's going to be good with that. Uh, just such a stupid issue because what they found here was the experience system. Uh, Actively did like fleet management. They could track systems or GPS vehicle tracking. They could track the vehicles. That includes things like OnStar functionality. Is one of the subsidiary companies. So police department, ambulance, truckers, basically anybody that's using these fleet management systems. They found, a very obvious target, admin.spirion.com, And, they show the login screen here, and you'll notice nicely at the bottom there, copyright 2006 to 2011. Um,
You can tell just by looking at the styling of the web page too.
oh yeah, and just admin login.php. I mean, yes, PHP is really popular still, but it's largely fallen out of favor when it comes to corporate applications that aren't like just a CMS. So when you still see it being used, it's at least a little bit of a red flag or just a sign that things are going to get fun. Not always, in fairness. Like there is kind of modern PHP does a bit better. Nonetheless, they were able to do a very straightforward SQL injection here. They did have to deal with the WAF a little bit, but effectively, as the username, include the single quote, include the comment, and just bypass the password check and log in as any user they want. At which point, they're in the system, able to do actively everything. Logging in as one of the higher privileged administrative users, access to everybody under every fleet. Uh,
Look at that page design and those colors and everything, man. Wow. If
very
that doesn't
PHP.
scream early 2000s PHP, yeah.
Yes.
But
And then the regex bypass seemed like they were able to find another API that the admin application was actually communicating with. They noticed HTTP 500 error. They also noticed that they would get a 403 when trying to access slash admin or slash dashboard on it. Or I think it might, yeah, anything with admin in it, actually, or anything with dashboard in it. But through a little bit of fuzzing, they found that just including a 0D character in there uh, would basically just bypass it. That is, I want to say the new line, but that might be the carriage return. I forget which one's which. Um, Either way, including that character, that's the regex bypass. Seems like something was just scanning for that text to be there. So by having a new line, it didn't quite match what they wanted. And basically could break it that way. And by sending all the requests that way, they were able to access the uh, that API's admin dashboard, or well, the admin and the dashboard. Uh, Stupid issues. I'm not surprised to see it on old thing. I don't know how many times you're going to find such a simple SQL injection here, but at the same time, they did, and like really worth still testing for, I guess. Um, some of the other issues that they had in here, going really quickly, one of them with BMW, uh, they basically found the waddle for the REST application, so they now knew all of the endpoints there. Found one exposed the time-based one-time password. So basically, when you go through the forgot password flow, it would use that API to like get the TOTP. Um, and so they could just make that same request, get the TOTP, and log in and reset the password of any user, including dealership users. And I think there was one other issue, right? In Ferrari, in their API, the issue on that one, basically they just found like the back office, or they basically found some internal APIs running on the API.ferrari.com, which kind of expected. It has both the public and internal APIs there. Found information from the JavaScript and how they're being called and stuff. What they ended up finding was one endpoint in the back office application here. They found this one endpoint that would basically just list all of the REST connectors, which were effectively acting as like proxies to other REST endpoints or other REST APIs. And that would include both the API location and the authorization token. So that gave them the token to start messing with the production API, and they can just give themselves, super user privileges or make themselves an owner of a vehicle or whatever. Uh, Really just a case of like information disclosure gone wild. A lot of information just coming out of that.
it's a bit of an interesting impact because I think Ferrari does this. I know Lamborghini does this, but they have that system where you can't buy certain models without having already been a previous owner of a like Ferrari or Lamborghini or whatever for like a certain amount of years. I wonder if you could use an attack like this to bypass that if you wanted to buy like a higher model or something. I don't know. It's just kind of an interesting attack scenario I thought of. I remember talking about this like years ago with someone. Um, not not hacking Ferrari obviously, but the fact that they have those like exclusive models and stuff. That could be an interesting like attack scenario with a bug like this.
I imagine you could do it. At the same time, um, it feels like quite the risk when you're going to do that,
Probably,
fake having
yeah.
buying one, compromise Ferrari and then give them all your information to buy a vehicle from them.
That's true.
Like,
Probably
yes,
wouldn't be the smartest idea, but
yeah, it feels like the sort of thing that probably, like, you could do it, uh, but you probably shouldn't.
yeah. In theory though, it could still work out, and that could be like a really cool motivation, I guess. But yeah, a lot of interesting issues here and exploits. A few of them are based around misconfigured SSO, which is like, pinning home that point that SSO is tough and it's easy to set it up lazily and just call it a day, which seems to be what happened in some of these cases. But yeah, like a pretty mixed bag of issues all around. And like I said, I like a lot of the exploits that they talked about here. As I said at the top of the article, like there is also the Twitter threads. We didn't really go through those. One of them I think we did go through on our last episode before we went on break. That was the Hyundai one. I think that was number 6, but there are a few other ones there if anyone's interested. Um, yeah, this one here is like knowing only the VIN number of the card you can remotely unlock and locate it and stuff. So yeah, there's a few other ones with interesting impact. We won't go into those for sake of time, but they are there. Feel free to check them out. And yeah, cool post all around, and some research by a lot of cool people here. All right, so we'll get into our next post here, which is a research post on performing prototype pollution in Python, which is notable because typically when you're talking about prototype pollution, you're talking about a language like JavaScript, where it's prototype based and objects inherit properties from their parents. Top level parent being the prototype. Python doesn't really have prototypes exactly, though it does have special attributes that can be modified at runtime, and that's what this post dives into. So it's sort of the same style of attack. So Z, I'll let you take this one away.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if I'd wanna call this one, like, a Python prototype pollution exactly. And I will just give a quick warning, I guess, for those of you who are trying to spot the vuln. The code was very much based off something from in here, so, if you wanna kinda figure out how this works, I mean, I guess knowing the title also is kinda giving you a pretty big hint, but might wanna skip ahead or not, or just listen and get it spoiled for you before tomorrow, whatever. But yeah, I'm not sure I'd want to quite call this prototype pollution, but at the same time, I'm not sure what to call it exactly. It does feel like it's almost like it is similar even to mass assignment. So the core issue that the take appears is you don't really have prototypes. But what they did find is if you have that same kind of core merge vulnerability, so oftentimes when it comes to prototype pollution, you end up having something that's just assigning attributes to an object without consideration over what the attributes are. Just, can I assign it? Yes. Okay, go ahead and like assign it. So they have this vulnerable recursive merge, similar to what you might see in JavaScript, where it's just maybe taking query string parameters and assigning it to the object. So a user could assign to the underscore proto or the prototype attribute, and then kind of get something added as the attribute or as part of the prototypical attribute. Um, can't really do that in this case. What you can do though is, or at least a couple of things that they did kind of try here is basically just start accessing all of those internal attributes and navigating their way around. So if you've ever played a PyJail CTF challenge where you're inside of like a little Python jail, you probably mess around with some similar things here with like the dot class and all those other little values that you've got hidden away in there. I didn't realize that these functions actually had names, but the dunder methods, double underscore methods, where start and end with double underscores, as apparently they call them dunder. Um, I didn't know that. I learned that from this right up here. But effectively, they'll implement like the various actions that uh Python might go ahead and use. So get and set attribute, obviously. Adding would be another one. Absolute things that kind of are mirrored by built-in actions. So if you want to implement your own implementation of add, you could do that by implementing those methods. Anyway, so they have some like class or base that are going to be filled in on every object, and you can kind of move around the hierarchy of objects and start assigning parameters as part of the actual class. So you do get a bit of a pollution in that sense. It's just never going to be as generic as actually modifying like the root object that all PHP objects inherit from, like you might get with the JavaScript prototype pollution. Um, Quickly out of chat, 777 Master 7 asks, by the way, you two sometimes talk, do you play CTF from time to time? What team are you playing for? Um, I don't still play. I did play with Acme Pharmaceuticals for a little while, and a little bit with Neg9 when I was physically out there. Um, so like DEF CON, OpenCTF, I played a couple times with them. Um, that's for myself. I don't Spectre. I don't think you still play at all, do you?
No, I haven't played a CTF in it's got to be a couple years at this point. I think like 2019 was the last time I really played it. I mostly played it solo. I didn't really play with a team. I did
Grooves over
collaborate a
here.
little bit. I did sometimes, hit up some people that I knew for, advice or whatever. We'd tackle a challenge, or like I'd nerd snipe some people. Like I nerd sniped Z a couple times. But in terms of like a properly structured team, I haven't really been part of one. I was never really huge into like the competitive CTF. I did like to dabble in it. Um, I kind of became jaded with CTF though. I feel like a lot of the challenges got repetitive, and the meta started shifting towards um, more like obscure knowledge type problems, as opposed to like interesting and fun challenges. So I haven't done it in a couple years. I have thought about revisiting it, but I haven't yet. So.
Yeah, I get nerd sniped from time to time. If somebody asks for help on a question, I'll dive into it. And I don't mind doing that, but I don't play with any team at all anymore either. Anyway, so jumping back into the vulnerability here, they're starting off with that core problem or that core vulnerability of just being able to assign values to any attributes, and what can you do with that as a primitive. Um, One of the first things they target here is this .class qual name, so they're able to change the name that actually shows up in like the stack trace to included. In this case, they're able to kind of trace their way up the various inheritance chain of objects using the base value. Um, and one of the examples here that they use here is this they have a class recruiter. It inherits from HR, which is a type of employee, and there's also this sysadmin class that inherits from employee also. So they have the vulnerability, and the vulnerability happens on this merge on the recruiter um, object there. So it's only dealing with recruiter, but yet by assigning into class base custom command, they're actually able to mess with the uh, fields of a sysadmin class. When a sysadmin class gets made, actually not even gets made, it can already exist. They'll be modifying kind of the core or the base class of it, so it'll read it later on. They can kind of mess the other class. So you can get by navigating these base chains, you can get to a lot of classes. More importantly, or more interesting than that, I thought is also the fact that you can access the methods. And when you can access a method, there is this value called the globals, and inside the globals is going to be the variables, the global variables or global scoped variables. So you can actually end up assigning through the class tree, make your way into globals, and make your way to uh, any of the global values in the application and assign those alternative values. And so they use an example of like just changing a not accessible variable to actually give it some other value, which is an interesting attack. One of the cool exploits that they actually came up here that feels like it might be somewhat practical is they also found like going through globals you can then access the imports, so like import OS, um, and through the imports, what they found here is at least on sub process, when it does the p open, if shell is true, it'll try and read an environment variable, this os environ get comspec to get wherever command.exe is or whatever your default shell is. On Windows, it does this. So they could use this attack to go into globals, hit the sub process import, hit its OS import, um, access the environment, modify it to, open a calculator basically, and have that be the default shell that gets executed whenever subprocess. So that subprocess call looks okay and looks fine, but through this sort of pollution attack or mass assignment attack, they're able to gain code execution, which I thought was a really cool way of explaining this. They also talk about going after the KW defaults and default values, which are like the defaults for a method. So you can change if a call to the method doesn't provide an argument, that's where it reads the defaults from. You can mess with that too. But I really thought this subprocess one kind of hit it home, the potential damage that could be done with this. It does still rely on this merge, which I haven't seen that often, or just that sort of primitive. I haven't seen that often, but at the same time, it's not something I've looked for a lot when it comes to Python because I haven't really been aware of exploiting it in this way. Oh no, it was kind of an eye opening. It's a cool post. I lean towards seeing it as a bit more of a mass assignment, but you do have the pollution aspect when you go into the other classes. It's just like those root classes are all immutable, so you can't actually modify them. It does have to be a mutable class that you mess with. Um, Unless I thought it was reasonably, yeah, I'll say reasonably well written. There are a couple places where it feels a little bit weird. In terms of ordering, like example, talking about an example before they show it, sort of deal. Um, but it covered the issue pretty well, I think. Like, check it out. I really enjoyed this post and learned a few things from it.
Yeah, I like the post. Some one of the reasons I think I liked it was it almost shares some similarities with binary exploitation. You're basically like chaining up your primitives to be able to get to more and more interesting things. Now, obviously, the attacks that were demonstrated here, it is going to depend on the target application quite a bit. So it's not something that's going to be like universal. You can just use this anywhere. It does, take some liberties and assuming things will be set up a certain way. But that is fair. It is a research post. It's just pointing out how it could potentially be used. Um, yeah, I was thinking going back to like when you were first getting into the topic. Um, I was kind of thinking the same thing with like I don't know if like prototype pollution is the right word, but it is it is a very similar concept. Um, and yeah, I thought this was kind of a cool attack, and I think they did a decent job explaining it. Like you said, there were a few points where I was a bit confused because they started talking about something as if they'd already talked about it, and then I was like, wait, they didn't. So I had to jump around a little bit, but um, yeah, I mean, it doesn't take away from the post though. Like, there's still some cool information here. It's also worth noting that the author is planning to update this as time goes on. They have like in the TLDR section, they're saying it will be frequently updated with new results. So it's worth keeping an eye on it. Maybe check back into it in a month or two or something, and maybe there might be some more examples or some other uh, viable techniques for exploiting this. So yeah, it's a
Yeah,
it's a cool post to have in your tool belt, I guess.
I doubt this is all. I love to see some actual vulnerabilities rather than just the research here. Yeah, it does depend on that little bit of a weird merge function or something doing something similar, but like I said, I've seen that sort of thing before, so I'm sure, now that's being called out, very well might be able to find this in a number of places. Actually feels like something I could write a code kill query to find some starting places. Exploitation kind of depends a little bit on what else the application does after it happens, but yeah, I mean, again, awesome post.
All right, so our next vulnerability is a bit of a fun one coming out of HackerOne from Nintendo's bug bounty on a vuln in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe on the Switch, which is pretty interesting because I think this might be the first time we've covered a Nintendo bounty. I can't recall when we've covered one before. So,
We've covered well, I'm not sure if there's a bounty for it, but we have covered some 3DS. I do remember a 3DS issue. It was like a frame. It was a memory corruption issue. It was a while back.
okay. Well, first one in a while at least. So, yeah, this issue here was a access controls issue when it came to creating competitions or tournaments on the game. So for those of you who haven't played Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, I haven't. I had to look into it a bit. You can basically create tournament circuits in the game. So you can customize the tournament rule set, the date it will run on, the number of races, whether it's public or private for just friends or whatever, stuff like that. It seems like a pretty cool feature. The problem is, under the hood, the create competition method of the matchmake extension protocol on the server would take an attribute list. And some of these attributes were used to filter whether or not a competition is put in the recommended section of the game, which is right next to like Nintendo's official tournaments. You can probably see where this is going. Those attributes weren't validated, and so you could just patch your own attributes when creating the tournament and have it recommended by using the API method directly. So, yeah, it's a bit of a like weird impact. You're not getting anything super sensitive. You're basically just getting your tournament recommended when you bypassing the mechanics of the game, basically. Um, but still, it's kind of a cool bug. It netted a $577 bounty, and yeah, it's a bit of an interesting impact because yeah, you're not compromising like the CIA, but it is bypassing a mechanic that's important to Nintendo. So,
Yeah, like I
yeah,
mean, being recommended there is something that would could make a difference, but only in like a personal, like, oh, I get to play with more people on this game sort of deal. You could probably put some inappropriate messages there and stuff too. But at its root, this is just the issue of really like a client side validation. They only expect the users to be able to use the game to set certain attributes, and so they use this special attribute as like the recommended one. And somebody who just avoids the client and sets it up this way is able to effectively bypass that. In
yeah,
practice, it might take a little bit of extra work because you'd probably want to proxy the traffic off of an actual switch so you can, like, follow up with the rest of the competition creation. Um, it might be a little bit more than just sending the one thing, but that's kind of one guesswork on my side. And two, actually, I'll just leave it at that. I'm not entirely sure exactly what the process would be to exploit it. I imagine you would need a little bit more than just sending the request to actually fully have the competition up and running, like most of it and stuff. But yeah, I mean, client side validation is it pops up in the weirdest places, and just as a bug, like you said, it's not something that's insanely high severity. Although they did give it a 7.2 here. Um,
So
you know
on the
what?
severity aspect, there is one other thing that I didn't really think of too much before, and it's actually in the last like sentence of the summary. They say the game was fetching up to 20 official competitions and only 4 already existed, so a malicious user could use up to 16 rows. So you could kind of like DOS the recommended section so that nothing else could get recommended, I guess. And I kind of wonder what would happen if you tried to do like more than 16. Like, what would happen there? I don't know. I can only like speculate, and I don't want to go too much into that because I feel like I don't have enough information to speculate hard. But
I don't think it's the case that it's if you're thinking about like memory corruption, I don't think that's what would happen here.
No, I don't think it would be something like that. I just wonder if it would be in like a queue system. So if you could just like fill up the queue so that like nothing could get recommended for a while unless, somebody manually went in and fixed it. Um, that's kind of what I was thinking of with that. But
Okay, I would imagine not because this is part of a search. You'll notice that if you actually take a look at the matchmaking or the GitHub here, it's like this simple search object that's both the request and response. And so that makes me think more likely rather than being queue, it's just returning the top result.
yeah,
So a new one created would probably come up on top, although there's probably the option to search by like your sword option. Uh,
for sure.
I don't see it there, but there's probably something. They don't have it completely documented here. Either way,
Yeah,
still
I
a
think
fun
this
little
is
issue.
like pretty much entirely reversed. So
Yeah, it is.
Um, but yeah, I mean, there's some interesting impacts there. I did notice that too, that the severity was high. I'd be curious on that, but it's hard to know because it's like a limited disclosure, so we don't have access to the comments and everything going back and forth. But yeah,
Nintendo
it's a bit of a fun bug.
Nintendo does feel like the sort of company that takes reputation and reputational issues a bit more seriously in that sense. I mean, granted, there's also a lot of bugs they just care about. Uh, but I could feel like something like that because of the reputational aspect, they'd be willing to give it a higher rating without necessarily having the CVSS reflect that severity.
Yeah, yeah, that's I think that's a fair assessment. But yeah, that's all we have on that topic. Our last topic here is a zero-click Facebook account takeover and two-factor authentication bypass by Yalla, and I'll let you get into this one, Z.
Yeah, and I'm gonna be upfront here. I am not confident in my understanding of how this bug entirely works, but there are still a couple of interesting takeaways that I can call out here. So basically within that finding, first of all, the first issue, they found just a GraphQL mutation that allows them to confirm an email without proving ownership. Effectively just make the call with the right arguments, it validates it. You don't actually have to own the account, or you don't actually have to do like the right link or whatever. Uh, the account takeover seems a bit more interesting though. Um, what they ended up finding was this is shared phone no signal. I see that just in the body of I guess one say a response body here having multiple parameters. They find this value and they just change it. So the response comes back. They change that, having the response say it's true, and then the next request out is different in that it now includes the shared phone number value. In like the next request in the password reset flow now has the shared phone number value, which they were able to modify, and by putting the victim's phone number in there, having the CUID, an encrypted user ID, they would receive the OTP themselves for the victim's phone number. Now I'm not sure what's going on there. Um Post isn't super clear. They apparently received the same 8-digit OTP on a second phone number, so it sounds like it's sending it to two locations. Although in that case, I feel like that shared number, like I don't know, I'm a little bit confused there, but it is one of those cases of just tampering with the parameters and seeing what happens. So I at least wanted to call it out here. Interesting case, but I'm not exactly sure what was going on with like how it worked. I wish they'd maybe written this one a little bit better. Um, but still, I mean, if it works how I think it worked, in that it's like sending it to, they're using the encrypted user ID to get the right place to send it to and sending it off on the shared phone, and then something else is kind of getting mixed up over which value to use. Where it's taking that shared phone number and oh, what account does that belong to when they go and validate? Um, they're able to log in using it. Or sorry, change the password using it. It's an interesting bug. I just wish I understood it a little bit more. still want to kind of call it out here nonetheless.
Yeah, it seems to be some kind of like state confusion type issue on the back end. It's kind of hard to say what's going on here, and I'm a little bit confused as well uh, with like exactly why this is happening. But there's definitely like some kind of state corruption going on there. Um, and yeah, it makes sense to try to tamper with these kinds of variables to see if you can mess with the state in that way. We've seen a few vulnerabilities that are sort of similar to this before. Um, and particularly with Facebook because their auth flow is just so like complicated and so involved. But yeah, I think there are some cool takeaways from this, like check out those parameters, keep like state level issues in mind. But yeah, unfortunately, it is a little bit hard to comment too much on it where there's some details that aren't really well explained. So yeah.
Yeah, perhaps
uh
if you actually went and looked at the flow, like, and kind of tried to do it along, I mean, presumably this is fixed already. But if you tried to do it along, you'd maybe see a little bit better what they're talking about. But yeah, kind of
if you're
lacking
a
a
bit more familiar with the setup, yeah, it
yeah.
might make more sense to you. All right.
But I don't know. It seemed interesting enough to call out here because this sort of OTP bypass. I mean, shared phone number is probably not a common feature to see, regardless. It just seems
Yeah, I
so
can't think of
interesting.
anywhere else I've
I
really seen
wish I
that.
understood it better.
Yeah. All right. So, Z, I think you have a shout out, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up the show.
Yeah, really quick shout out here, just as how SAML works and some attacks on it. Honestly, if you find yourself running into SAML on whatever, um, it really is just the overview and some of the kind of common attack scenarios. And that's really all the post is. It's just an overview, just some background information. Um, yeah, I kind of want to shout out because SAML was a real pain to kind of try and parse through and get through. So having this kind of security centric right above it is pretty nice.
All right, cool. So that's everything that we have for today. Thank you, everyone who tuned in. The VOD will be up on Twitch immediately or on other platforms like YouTube tomorrow. You can also check out our Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and we have more stuff on Anchor. If you want to join our Discord and follow us on Twitter, links for those are down below or in the chat. And with that said, we'll be back tomorrow for the binary episode. That'll be at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, and we'll see you then.